Moose Pond, Denmark, Maine. Day 1 of the first session, late afternoon, summer 1952. A girl of 12, from the Back Bay in Boston, first year at camp. She had taken the overnight Boston and Maine sleeper to Portland, and then the camp bus 2 hours north. And now the gravel drive had ended at a lake she had not expected. Cold and dark, with spruce trees reaching to the rocky shoreline without a beach between them. A dock extended into the water. The counselor, already standing at the dock's end, was not watching what the girls were doing. She was watching how they looked at the lake. The girl from the Back Bay was not looking at the dock. She was looking at the far shore, more spruce trees against the afternoon sky, which meant that the lake was all there was between here and wherever that tree line ended, and that whatever this place was, it was all there was going to be for the summer. The counselor had seen this look before. She had worn it herself at 12, at this lake, on this same afternoon. What was she reading in it? Camp Wyonagonek was established in 1902 in Denmark, Maine, on Moose Pond in the Oxford Hills, and is recognized by the American Camp Association as the oldest continuously operated girls' camp in the United States. Its original advertisement described what it offered in one phrase: freedom from enervating luxuries. 5 years later, in 1907, Dr. Luther Halsey Gulick and his wife Charlotte Vetter Gulick founded Camp Wohello on Sebago Lake in Raymond, Maine. Charlotte coined the name from the first 2 letters of work, health, and love. The National Film Preservation Foundation holds a 1919 film of Wohello describing the camp's creation as a radical development towards equality of the sexes. What Gulick, co-founder of the Campfire Girls, designer of the IMCA's triangular logo, the man who helped inspire basketball, built into the physical design of Wohello, was a proposition American institutional life had not yet accepted, that girls required and deserved the same outdoor physical education as boys. Wohello opened in 1907. American women would not vote for another 13 years. What was happening on Sebago Lake in 1907 takes some time to understand correctly. Day 3 of the first session, 2:30 in the afternoon. Rest hour. The letter to her mother had been started on day 1 and had not been finished. At a camp near the New Jersey hills, day 3 homesickness at 2:30 was one specific thing. At a Maine lake camp, at Wyonagonek on Moose Pond, at Wohello on Sebago, at any camp accessible only by overnight train and a 2-hour bus north from Portland, it was that thing and something more. No town was visible from the cabin. No road was within earshot. The spruce trees reached the water, and the lake extended to the far shore, and the fog came at dusk. Day 1 homesickness at a Maine camp was the shock of the distance, the train, the cold of northern water, the loons she had heard the previous evening from somewhere she could not locate on any map she knew. Day 3 at 2:30 was different. Not the shock of the distance, but the comprehension that the distance was the permanent condition for the duration, and that there was nothing here but this, and that this was the only world available. What did that specific comprehension do? The counselor on the dock was 19. She had been at this Maine lake camp, first as a camper at 9, returning each summer, for 10 years, before the summer she returned as a counselor. The documentary record of Maine camps, like Wyonagonek and Camp Timnaus, confirms what these camps themselves report. Their counseling staffs were drawn in large numbers from former campers. At Camp Timnaus, on Sebago Lake, the entire counseling staff had attended as campers, and more than 50% of families were second generation. They returned not as staff trained in camp procedures, but as people for whom the camp was a layer of identity they had not shed when they left. The counselor on the dock had heard the loons from the same bunk on day 3. She had not finished her first letter on day 3. She knew what the girl stepping off the bus needed, and she knew something a counselor at a Catskills camp 3 hours from New York could not have built from 3 summers alone. What it meant to need it here, at this specific distance from anything familiar. What the counselor did not do on day 3 at 2:30 was offer comfort. Comfort addressed the wrong thing. It assumed the issue was a grief that needed reassurance. What was actually happening at 2:30 on day 3 was not grief. It was adjustment, a specific developmental work that required duration and would not be shortened by being soothed. What the counselor knew, from having been at this lake at 12, and from watching 40 girls go through this passage, was that what day 3 at 2:30 needed would arrive on its own by the morning of day 7 if she did not interfere. The bunk, the 6 girls who had not chosen each other, would begin to be the place where she was from, not home, the place she was currently in. By day 7, that specific distinction would have collapsed, and she would not remember it collapsing. The camp had organized for this arrival without naming it. What did the camp's design have to do with when it arrived, and with why it arrived here, at this specific remoteness, with a particular weight it would not have carried at a camp 3 hours from Boston? The waterfront at a Maine lake camp was not the waterfront at a camp in the Catskills or the Adirondack foothills. The cold of a northern Maine lake stayed cold even in July, temperatures that required genuine encounter rather than casual entry. Wohello's documented sailing program on Sebago Lake, with its open water and reliable afternoon wind, and Wyonegonic's program on Moose Pond, meant that the waterfront was not a single program element, but the entire physical world the session inhabited. The swim test at the session's start determined what a girl could do and where she could go on the water. Passing the full swimmer's test at a Maine lake was not the same as passing it at a camp with a sheltered beach. It meant cold, dark water that had not been arranged to welcome her, and then the canoe, and eventually the stern of the canoe, which was different, because the stern set the course. What did cold water that had not been arranged for you produce in a girl of 12 from the Back Bay? And what did the stern of a canoe on a Maine lake, the first time she set a course rather than followed one, produce that the bow had not? The physical design of the Maine camps was shaped by the landscape they occupied. At Wyonegonic on Moose Pond, 700 acres of pine and spruce forest and 2 miles of rocky lake shoreline were not a backdrop. They were the camp's primary structural element. The wooden buildings with names painted on their lintels sat among the trees on the slopes above the water, occupying the landscape at its margins rather than dominating it. The dining hall, the craft building, the sailing dock, the archery range at the field's edge, each was smaller than the spruce forest that enclosed it. The camp did not arrange the Maine landscape into a setting for the activities it hosted. The Maine landscape arranged the camp into something smaller than itself, and the children who lived there for 6 or 7 weeks lived inside something larger than anything the program had designed. What did that proportion do to a girl of 12 from the Back Bay, where nothing had ever been larger than the buildings her family occupied? And what did living inside something that dwarfed the entire institution produce, that a camp in a more managed landscape could not? To understand what was happening at Camp Wohelo in 1910, you need to know what was not available to American girls in 1910. No organized outdoor education for girls. No institutional framework for placing a 12-year-old in a canoe on Sebago Lake and expecting her to set her own course. The National Film Preservation Foundation's 1919 Camp Wohelo film describes the camp's creation as a radical development towards equality of the sexes. Charlotte and Luther Gulick designed the Wohelo program specifically because girls needed the same encounter with the physical world, the same development of competence and self-direction that boys' camps were providing. Campfire Girls, the organization the Gulicks formally incorporated in 1912, was the first non-sectarian, multicultural, multiracial organization for girls in America. The private Maine girls' camps that the Gulick tradition shaped were something more limited than that. They drew from the professional and business families of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. They were overwhelmingly white. They were expensive. Understanding those limits is as much a part of what they were as their progressive character. Who attended these camps and who did not? From a Maine lake camp, a letter sent on Tuesday reached Boston by Thursday morning at the earliest. A reply written Thursday arrived at camp on Saturday. The connection between parent and child ran entirely through 4 days of handwritten pages, minimum, each way. This was not a communication lag, but a structural condition that shaped what the letters contained. A child writing to her mother from Moose Pond on Tuesday was writing to the person who had existed on Sunday at South Station, and would receive a reply from that Sunday person on Saturday, when camp had moved on several days further. The letter required the writer to hold still inside her experience long enough to describe it, a specific act of self-understanding that a phone call did not require. What the letter home from a Maine camp contained is what the writer understood well enough to hold still, in language, at the time of writing. The counselor who saw both the child and the letter understood something about the gap between them that the parent receiving the letter could not see. What did that gap look like from inside the camp? The early morning swim in a Maine lake was not a scheduled program element at most camps. It was a choice, made before breakfast, before the day's formal activities began. The cold of a northern Maine lake at 6 in the morning in July was not the cold of a heated pool or a southern lake warmed by summer. It required a specific decision each morning to enter water that had not been arranged to welcome her and that would not become comfortable, only familiar. What doing this daily for 6 or 7 weeks produced in a girl of 12 from the Back Bay was not toughness. It was a specific relationship with cold water, a knowledge that she could enter it, that entering it was possible, that the first shock was finite and followed by something she had chosen and could choose again. That knowledge did not arrive in one morning. It accumulated. By the end of the session, it was a form of competence that the program had not named and the girl could not fully describe, but that she carried home in August, alongside the trunk. Camp Wohello was still directed by the great-grandchildren of Luther and Charlotte Gulick at the time of this writing. 4 generations of the Gulick Van Winkle family. Wisonagonic documented 3rd and 4th generation campers in its official records. What this depth of generational continuity produced was a specific form of institutional tradition. The songs at a Maine camp in 1952 were taught by girls who had learned them from girls who had learned them from the original counselors of the 1910s and 1920s. The ceremony at Wyonagonic's final night, the youngest girls walking to the dock with candles while the senior campers paddled in from 2 directions to form an arc on the water, was not a performance. It was a practice transmitted across so many cohorts of children that no single child who participated in it had invented any part of it. What does living inside an institution older than your grandparents do to the summer you are currently in? And what does transmitting its traditions to the children arriving for the first time do to the counselor who has been inside those traditions long enough to forget that she learned them? The Maine private camps were expensive. Train fare from Boston's South Station to Portland, plus the camp fee, placed the experience beyond most working-class families. Camp Merriweather, on Great Pond in North Belgrade, drew boys from Groton School in Massachusetts. A 1923 Wohello brochure required that equipment be purchased from Camp Supplies, Inc. in Boston, the supplies themselves available only in the city from which the camp's families came. The camps along Moose Pond and Sebago Lake drew from the professional and business families of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. They were predominantly white. Racial exclusion, formal or informal, was the pattern of American private camp culture broadly, and Maine was not an exception. The Campfire Girls, which the Gulicks formally incorporated in 1912 and explicitly founded as the first non-sectarian, multicultural, multiracial organization for girls in America, was a different institution from the private Maine camps their Wohello tradition had shaped. Understanding what these camps produced requires understanding who was inside them. What they built in the children who attended is genuine. What they did not build, because those children were not permitted to attend, is the other half of what they were. Maine summers included genuine multi-day rain. Extended rainy stretches in wooden camp buildings without heat were documented among the real hardships of the experience. The lake disappeared behind mist. The dock was wet and empty. The waterfront program moved to the craft building or the dining hall's long tables. What the rainy Maine day produced, when it lasted 2 days, or 3, or 4, was a specific compression of the bunk community. The 6 girls who had been managing their time together were now managing it inside a small radius, in the rain, with no scheduled program to begin in an hour. The card games at long tables, the wool blankets, the smell of wet spruce and pine needles through the screen window. What those hours produced was not planned. The program had not designed for rain. The rainy afternoon gave the bunk community the one thing the program's activity schedule could not: time that could not be filled with anything but itself and each other. The loon called at dusk from somewhere across the lake. Former Maine camp alumni, documented in Down East Magazine's collection of camp memories, which includes Camp Renoya alumna Stacy Snyder of Philadelphia, who cited the lakes and the loons as the defining elements of her camp summers from 1974 to 1976, described the loons' call as the single most specific sense memory of their Maine summers, carried for decades with unusual precision. What the loons' call did on day 3 was different from what it did on day 7. On day 3, heard from the bunk after dark, a sound unlike any sound the Back Bay had ever produced. It was one more piece of evidence that nothing here was the place she came from. By day 7, the same call from the same lake was not the sound of an unfamiliar place. It was the sound of this place, which had begun to be the place she was from. The loon had not changed. What had changed, and who had organized that change without naming it? The last morning at a Maine lake camp had a specific quality that mirrored the first afternoon. The girl who arrived in June, not knowing what the loon was left, in August knowing it by sound, from across the dark lake. The girl who had not been able to finish a letter on day 3, left having written letters that described things the Back Bay had given her no vocabulary for. What the camp had produced in the girl leaving in August was not a list of skills, though swimming and sailing and canoeing were real. It was a specific reorganization of what she understood herself capable of, the knowledge, acquired by accumulation over 6 weeks, that she could enter cold water that had not been arranged for her, set a course in the stern of a canoe, and be in a community she had not chosen, and be formed by it. The counselor who watched her load the trunk onto the bus had watched 35 other girls do the same thing. She could see what had changed. What had the camp done without announcing it? The 1970s were documented as a tough decade for Maine private camps. The overnight State of Maine train from Boston's South Station to Portland, which had run since 1913, had ended service in October 1960. Families drove instead, arriving the same day, the landscape changing too quickly for the internal transition the train had organized across the night. Camps began offering 3.5-week sessions alongside the traditional 7-week session, Wyonagonic on Moose Pond, in operation since 1902, adapted as other camps had adapted before closing. What the shorter session gave families, less cost, less time away, a child home before summer ended. What it did not give the child, the second session. The weeks built on the turn at the end of week 1. The loon had to stop sounding strange before the turn could occur, and the turn had to occur before weeks 3 through 8 had anything to build on. The 3.5-week session reached day 3 at 2:30, and the bus came on day 24. Day 3 had not been the same.